Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. I am Elizabeth Corey, and I am the founder of beatingtrauma.com. And I am here today to talk to you about trauma and our trauma responses. And I'm really looking forward to kind of talking about this today from the perspective of the controller. So, for those of you who haven't followed me for very long, the controller is equivalent to the ego self. And because I speak in parts language, the controller is one of the primary parts in our system that we need to get past in order to fully heal ourselves. And by get past, I mean their defenses. The controller has strong defenses. And that's actually what we're going to talk about today is when I talk about strong defenses, you might be thinking, oh, well, then I would definitely see them. And I am here to tell you that no, you wouldn't. You actually probably don't even begin to have like the full understanding of the extent of your controller's ability to stop you from healing and feeling and remembering and all the things you need to do to live your best life. So, I mean, I am still discovering things my controller's trying on me, what feels like every single day, and I teach this stuff. So I can say it's quite the journey to discover just how intense our controller defenses actually are, and in particular, how tricky they actually can be, because they're very tricky. So today we're going to talk about that trickiness and how it shows up, because the controller operates in our minds mostly. Now, there are physical manifestations of the controller for sure, but they operate a lot in the mind. And the way they operate it's very hard to determine that that's actually a part and not just who we are. It's like my mind is telling me things. That must be me, right? Like that's what we would think. But most of the time when the mind is telling us things, it is the controller and it is coming from their fears. And so the more we pay attention to what the mind is telling us, the more we can get in touch with the unconscious drivers of those thoughts. And that's ultimately what's going to lead us to a much more peaceful existence, truly. So I want to start off by saying hi to Carol and Rebecca and Jan. So glad you guys are joining. Thanks for being here today. What I want to do before I get into how they go about telling us these stories is I want to tell you why they do it. I think it's really important for us to understand the why. Because when they're telling us these stories that I'm going to talk about today, it appears, the stories, appear highly logical. They're very convincing. The controller is extremely convincing. They have been operating under these kind of set of rules for a very long time. And so for us, it just feels normal and natural to think this way. And the controller knows that. But deep down inside, while the controller can be quite fickle, their ultimate goal is always the same, and that is to avoid emotions. Okay? Avoid emotions no matter what. That's the goal. We're going to stay out of the body. We're going to stay away from the memories. We're going to stay away from how we feel. A successful life to the controller is a robot life. It's not sustainable or possible, but that is what the controller would deem a success, because that's them winning at life right there, right? They are terrified of emotions. Okay. So, I'm going to break down the stories today because of that. I'm going to break down the stories today by emotion. I figure it's not always this straightforward, but I figure it's kind of an interesting approach to take to kind of give you a sense, because the truth is, in this journey of recovery, all of us have emotions that feel a lot scarier to us than others. And by the way, those are not the same amongst everybody. So while you may relate to some of these controller stories for some of these emotions, you may find that for other emotions, you don't have these controller stories, at least not in the same way. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of break it down in this way, and you might find some stories you may be telling yourself as we go along here. And if you come up with something else, please feel free to let me know what it is. As I always say, I always give this disclaimer: this is not a fully encompassing list by any means, but it's just to get you thinking about what kinds of things the controller may be saying to you to avoid a particular emotion, right? Now, I'm going to start off with the easiest one. The easiest one is anger. And the reason it's easy is because, one, anger is really big. It's a big emotion. It creates a lot of anxiety in us when we're blocking it. So it's kind of easy to spot that something is not quite right. But also, society in general is very, very quick to stigmatize anger. So the controller's messages are pretty loud and clear. That said, we don't realize their defenses. Okay. And this is what I was getting at earlier, where it's like the controller's defenses are big, but that doesn't mean we necessarily realize they're big. So what are some of the stories the controller tells us when it comes to blocking our anger? I'm going to start off. I have 3 examples here, but we can kind of twist and turn these into many, many different examples. The first one I have here is you should practice forgiveness, or some version of forgiveness. Okay. This is one of the biggest messages that controllers tell us around anger. And it's not just our controllers that tell us that, it's everybody else's controllers, because it's important to also recognize that people who are using their own controllers to block their anger are then going to use their controllers to block your anger. By the way, this is called projection. And it's very, very big when it comes to emotional suppression. We will hear from all the controllers of the world that tell us we should practice forgiveness instead of being angry. We also have entire organizations like religions that are actually built on this concept of practicing forgiveness. Don't get me wrong. I'm not opposed to forgiving, but I am opposed to forgiving in the head and then using that as a way of blocking all of our emotions, which 99% of the time is what people have done when they say they've forgiven. So we want to be really cautious about that word. If we're telling it to ourselves, we want to just kind of dig deep inside and go, might I be blocking something with this story about forgiveness? Because the truth is, when we really, really forgive, what that basically means is that we have let go of the impact trauma is having on us to a large degree, because we have healed the emotions around the trauma. Not because we have said, I have made a decision in my head to forgive, and now I'm going to block everything that comes up about it. That's not forgiveness, right? So I hear this story a lot from a lot of people who, while I'm out there promoting anger as an expression of emotion, a lot of people are like, I don't like that. And here's why: I've chosen to forgive. And that's great. But that isn't necessarily what our system needs us to do. That is often a controller story, and it is run largely from the mind. So that's story number 1 about anger. The next one that I have is that anger won't change anything. Okay. And actually, to be fair, the controller will say this about every emotion. They will say, well, I feel that. It's not going to change anything. But there's a couple emotions where they use that most. Anger is one of them. I'm going to talk about the other one in a little bit. But anger won't change anything. So why be angry? So this is really important to understand, that we may be telling ourselves this. The truth is that while we don't want to go out there with our ungrounded anger and try to make change happen, usually we'll be fighting a lot. We'll be using a lot of energy, and we won't really be getting anywhere, because ungrounded anger is the kind of anger that generally doesn't bring about significant positive results. And it may just end up making people be more abusive to us instead of less. So I don't recommend that. However, if we process our ungrounded anger, and yes, you guessed it, writing is a big way to do that. This is where I tell everybody, rage on the page, put that anger down on paper. As we do that, our anger gets grounded. And when our anger gets grounded, we set better boundaries. And boundaries are the ultimate effect, so to speak, of processing our ungrounded anger. We get better at telling people where they can and can't be in our space. And this is a very powerful way to helping us develop a peaceful life, right? We need those boundaries to do that. Last week, I talked about establishing safety. Boundaries is how we do that. So as we process our anger, we start setting boundaries and establishing safety. So when the controller says anger won't change anything, they mean it's not going to change the event from the past. That's true, but it's going to change everything in the future because you're no longer going to be operating in those same patterns as you process your anger. So that's why we want to ignore that particular story, or as you might have guessed, write from it. By the way, all of these rules and stories I'm throwing out today from the controller are things you should write from, 100%. So I want to mention that too. The next one this is a little bit of spiritual bypassing here. And so I like to bring this up because when we're on this recovery journey, we often don't realize this. But the controller may be telling you it is best not to react to people because it means you are more highly evolved. Like, I hear from people all the time, they're like, I just want to do this recovery and get myself to a place where I'm zen and nothing that anybody ever does has any impact on me. Okay. That's not a human existence, okay? It's very important for us to understand that that actually is not healing. Like numbing ourselves out when people do things that are bad is not how we want to go about this world. As a matter of fact, we want to work hard to become as sensitive as humanly possible. Because when we are sensitive to others' behavior, we set boundaries, okay? And when we set boundaries, we stop having behaviors in our space that are not okay for us. So we're not more highly evolved when we numb out a natural response to abusive behavior. That's not highly evolved. That's the controller. Okay. So these are 3 of the stories we may be hearing in our head about anger in particular. The other thing is you may not even really be feeling the emotion. You may just hear the story, but we can often use the controller's stories to kind of give us hints about what emotion is underneath the surface. And this is one of those times when your controller starts lecturing you about forgiveness and peace and zen and high evolve, this, that, and the other. That's your hint that there may be some anger kind of hanging around, right? So that's some controller stories about anger. Let's move on to futility, because I know I can get to talking and then we will just run out of time. Futility. Now, this one's a little tougher because we don't always feel the futility when it's there. And that's because the controller is using dissociation and numbness to block it. But while they're doing that, there are some stories that they might be telling us that we can listen for. And maybe that, again, that will give us some clues that futility is present. When I talk about futility, futility is hopelessness. So it is the feeling that drives depression, okay? So what does the controller do when we start to feel futility? The first thing they do is they try to run us around. And so my first story is we must keep moving. We have so much to do. So one of the ways the controller addresses futility in our system is to run from it. Quite literally, actually. They will get really, really super busy and run you around and give you a 20-page to-do list and just keep you moving. And that's because they don't want you to sit still long enough for that futility to come into your system and start expressing itself. Typically when I feel that controller coming in and going, just do all the things, just do all the things, I'm like, okay, hold up. If my controller wants me to do all the things, it might be that there's some futility. It can also be other emotions that are there. But I noticed that the biggest emotion they seem to run from is the futility. They do not like being unproductive, generally speaking. So when the futility comes up, they will start to run. So the other thing they may tell you is if we sit around, we are being selfish or lazy. And we hear this a lot from the controller. Anytime we want to rest, we want to do something for fun, we want to take a vacation, we want to take a nap, we may hear the controller saying things like this, right? It's like, it's selfish to do that. You need to keep going. There's so much to do. They will use kind of guilt trips and things to keep you pushing, and that keeps you from connecting with the emotion that's underneath the surface. That's a big one for them. The last one, now they're not actually going to say these first two words, but when I was writing it, it felt important to make the point, which is let's panic, okay? There is so much to be stressed about. Now, what I mean by that is that the controller, if the controller can get you freaking out, like can get you in all of your anxiety and everything like that, you won't recognize the futility is right underneath the surface. So this is a distraction. And I would say that a lot of the times with futility, the controller uses distraction stories as their primary way of keeping you away from the futility. Probably more so than almost any emotion, they will use distraction. Although maybe grief a little bit as well. And Simon is saying, I find the Karma Kid uses guilt tripping a lot. Yes, the Karma Kid is the king of the guilt. There's no doubt. It's Simon saying, especially if I don't give them what they want. Yes, definitely. And what they usually want is some kind of loyalty to people that are not safe for us. But yes, they are the big guilt trippers. The controller will dabble in it. Okay. But yes, the Karma Kid, they are going to be where your biggest guilt comes from. And actually, that leads me into my next emotion, because guilt is actually what I would refer to as a feeling. And the emotion that drives guilt is the emotion of shame. So, and I didn't say this at the beginning, and I'll just mention it now. There are basically 5 traumatic emotions that I usually speak about and I operate from. And I'm actually writing an emotional workbook which focuses on those 5. So shame is one of those 5. We're going to walk through all 5 today, but shame is one of those 5. And it does, all of these emotions will drive different kinds of feelings. But I think it makes sense to keep the emotions at a small number, because honestly, this work is hard enough without being inundated with 1,000 things that we need to kind of work through to figure out what we're feeling. Operate on these 5. These are the 5 that I talk about all the time. I do love to oversimplify this stuff, at least for a while, because it helps us to get some understanding. Because the truth is, our defenders will come in and they will make everything extremely complex. And the purpose of that is to confuse us. By the way, that's another defense. So I'm trying to break it down into small chunks, but yes. So shame is next. So what is the controller? What are the controller stories around shame? The first one is a very common defense against shame, which is we just have to do better, try harder, and push more. Most of the time when shame is triggered, it's because something in the outside world has reflected back to us some kind of unworthiness that we feel deep down inside. Now, like Simon was talking about, one of the biggest ways in which we feel shame is through the Karma Kid. So the Karma Kid's a big shame holder. The controller spends most of their life trying to prove the Karma Kid wrong. So the Karma Kid says we're unworthy. Something happens in the world that triggers that unworthiness. Then the controller says, I'll just prove to the world that I'm not unworthy, that I'm not shameful by doing more, working harder, pushing, bull in a china shop, whatever it takes. I'll force it. I'll force everybody to see me as a great person by having all the power and, I don't know, all the status and all the money and all the gold medals that I possibly can, and that'll make me okay. And don't forget, I'll also be perfect. Okay. This is a response to shame. So when your controller starts in on you and says, I just have to be, what is the motto from the Olympics? Stronger, faster, I don't know. I'm blanking. Somebody knows, let me know. That is the controller when they are on shame. Now, the controller themselves is not necessarily the part that holds the shame, but they are trying to fight against it for sure. The next story is we can prove to everyone how amazing we are. So that's similar to the last one. You just have to keep doing better and we will make that happen. The controller believes the answer to shame is just to get everybody to love us. And yeah, we all know that that is a pretty unrealistic goal. But that's what they're trying to do. The last one that I have here is more around the way that we may react in the mind. This one is talking about like an individual, maybe an individual has in some way shamed us or insulted us. And so what might be going on in our mind? And I put down the person insulted us and we have to figure out how to keep that from happening again. Okay, this can turn into spinning in our heads. We can walk through the conversation a whole bunch of time and try to figure out what we could have said different, what we could have said better, how we could have redeemed ourselves, or we may move right into revenge, like I'm going to get them, I'm going to get them back. That stuff is actually based in the shame. Carol's controller so nicely looked it up for me. Faster, higher, stronger. Thank you. I knew it was something like that. It was on my mind. Once I started reading that stuff about the controller there. So thank you. Thank you, controller. So moving on to fear. I want to talk for a minute about fear. So fear is the controller's specialty. Actually, fear is the emotion the controller themselves operate in. So this is their world. This is their area of expertise. The problem is they're not the only part with fear. I don't know if that's a problem. It's just very confusing because a lot of times we'll have fear and we don't know. Is that defender fear? Is that controller fear? Is that inner children that are afraid? A lot of times we'll think the fear is coming from an inner child and it's coming from a defender. So this is their area. So very easily they can grab hold of that fear no matter where it's coming from and use it to kind of drive the controller's specialty. And my first one here, like controllers are very big on this idea of spinning. Controllers spin. I call it the mind spin. I'm talking about really fast and around and around and around and around really fast. So this spinning, the controller will tell you when you have fear coming up in your system, let's spin about everything that can go wrong. This is the controller's favorite thing to do. Okay. So when you can't get your mind to stop spinning, and it doesn't matter what it's about, any rabbit hole will do, just Google something, right? They will just spin and spin and spin and spin and spin. They're doing that because of their fear, but also because they are taking the fear of other parts and they're interpreting it as about today, which is the next story I have for the controller. Fear is always about today. It almost never is about today, by the way. I mean, unless you are actually in a very, very dangerous situation in your current life, fear is almost never about today. Fear is about something that happened in the past. The problem is because sometimes the fear can be so intense and what's happening today can be not as intense, we can be very quick to believe the invalidating statements of the controller that say, why would you be this scared? That's silly and dumb and ridiculous and not valid. And then we invalidate ourselves, right? That's what happens. But when we are spinning, we are likely feeling fear. And so acknowledging that and acknowledging that the controller is doing that can be very helpful. The last one, and honestly, it's our ultimate destination in our journey of emotional expression. It is the grief. And grief, by the way, is not always the same as sadness. Sadness may be an aspect of grief, but grief is very, very deep. So, and I will say that it is one of the emotions that scares the controller the most in all the emotions. And to be fair, they'll probably use every single story that I've told you today when it comes to grief. But I have some that are specific to grief too. One is nothing's going to change, so what help will crying do, right? Like, why bother crying? It's not going to fix anything. This is probably one of the biggest controller stories. We've all been telling ourselves this for years. We were probably told this when we were growing up. You know, crocodile tears, what good's that going to do? How's that helping anything? It's not going to fix it. It's not going to make it better. Get over it. all of that, right? So a lot of people will say to me, like, why is that going to help? It's not going to help. It's just going to make me sad. It's not going to do any good. That's a controller talking. They will also say things similar with the fear, where it's like, it's ridiculous to cry over something that happened such a long, long time ago. Why bother? Like, it's over. It's over. Who cares? Right? These are the stories of the controller. Yeah, as Simon is saying, I hear boo, hoo, hoo. Right, exactly. Which kind of gets into this last story around grief, which is that crying is weak, and if we are weak, we will be manipulated or some other form of being overpowered. Okay, that's a big one because we may have learned as children really, really fast that we can't be vulnerable in our environment. So, this is what the controller learned about grief, right? So now they're using that to keep you from grieving now. Even though, in fact, grief is one of the most productive, life-changing, body-changing, emotional expressions we could do for ourselves. And that's why we have such strong defenses against it, honestly. That is what I have for you today. I hope you found this helpful. I really appreciate you guys being here today. And thank you, Carol's controller, for helping me out. And thank you for the comments, Simon. And I hope you guys have a really great week. I will plan to be back with you next Tuesdays. And I appreciate you all so much for continuing this extremely brave journey. If you held on for this entire half hour, you're doing amazing stuff because controllers are going to make you want to get right off this call. So good job on you, and I will see you guys next week. Thanks.